I'm going to give you a briefer overview of chapters 3 and 4 of Mill's book, just covering the most important points for understanding what he's up to. These points don't have much effect on how we will apply the GHP, just how we understand it. So when Mill asks what are the sanctions of the principle of utility, of course, the principle in question is the greatest happiness principle. Sanction here means incentive, what motivation we would have to follow the greatest happiness principle in our own individual decision-making processes. For Mill, sanctions are external or internal. External sanctions come from outside myself, and internal sanctions come from inside myself. So now we want to look at a passage on external sanctions. And so this is from page 228, it's the third paragraph of chapter 3. Of the external sanctions, it is not necessary to speak at any length. And then he speaks about them at some length, and I'll break these down for you in the next slide. They are the hope of favor and the fear of displeasure from our fellow creatures or from the ruler of the universe, along with whatever we may have of sympathy or affection for them, or of love and awe for him, inclining us to do his will independently of selfish consequences. So what does that mean if we break it down? It means that we have 6 external sanctions, that is 6 external motivations for doing the right thing in terms of the greatest happiness principle. The first is the hope of reward from our fellow human beings. And the rewards can be fairly modest, right? So the reward that we get most often from our fellow human beings for doing the right thing is simply praise, or maybe it improves our reputation, right? So we get approval from other people for doing the right thing. Likewise, we can have a fear of punishment from others for doing the wrong thing. Now, again, that fear of punishment, obviously you could be put in jail, you could be put to death, you could be tortured and all of that. But in fact, most of the punishments that we fear from our fellow human beings are much smaller than that. So a bad reputation, being ostracized, being put out of a social group, losing a friendship, losing a relationship, sometimes losing a job over the fact that people perceive that we've done the wrong thing. So the first 2 external sanctions, hope of reward or fear of punishment from our fellow human beings. And then we have the same 2, but applying to what he calls the ruler of the universe, meaning of course God, the hope of reward from God. What do we mean by that? Well, ultimately we might mean something like heaven. But what if you're not religious? You could mean something like karma, that you hope that if you do the right things in this life, you will either be rewarded by the universe in this life or in the next life. If you do the wrong thing, you might be punished. Hell might be the punishment from the ruler of the universe for doing the wrong thing, or maybe a much lesser punishment of just not getting something that we want. And then 5 and 6, we're sometimes motivated not by reward or punishment, but by love, right? So we might be motivated by love for our fellow human beings, to help them out with something, to care for the environment, in which case what would apply there is love for our future conspecifics, for future fellow human beings. Also love of God, right? We might do the right thing even if we don't think that we would necessarily get a reward or punishment from it, but just because we love God and we love the laws of God, right? Obviously these things would apply somewhat differently for someone who's not religious, but you might simply like the idea of there being order in the universe and of contributing to it somehow. Okay, the next passage is Mill's definition of conscience, and we want to look sort of closely at this. Conscience is the internal sanction of duty. Okay, so he says here in the highlighted part, the internal sanction of duty, whatever our standard of duty may be, is one and the same, a feeling in our own mind. So conscience is a feeling, a pain more or less intense. So for Mill, conscience is always negative. It's always pain, more or less intense, attendant on the violation of duty. So he means either when we're doing the wrong thing, when we're violating the GHP, or when we're even thinking of violating the GHP in the next moment or some future moment, we're going to feel pain, which in properly cultivated moral natures rises in the most serious cases into shrinking from it as from an impossibility. So we have a kind of disgust from it. Now we do need to notice that he says here, which in properly cultivated moral natures. And this goes to the fact that conscience is not exactly innate. We're not born with a conscience. It's natural in the sense that we're born with the capacity to develop a conscience, to develop this internal sanction of duty, this internal motivation to follow the GHP. It's a natural proclivity, you might say, or an ability, but that ability has to be cultivated. And that's why, by the way, he says a pain more or less intense. So someone whose moral nature is more highly cultivated, someone who has learned and grown more in ethics, will feel more pain. Someone who has just a little bit of learning, a little bit of ethical development will have less pain. And so someone who's not morally educated or morally well-formed or morally developed, that person, their pain level might be relatively low at the thought of doing the wrong thing, and they might be able to overcome it more easily. But someone who has had more ethical learning or ethical development will have more pain and will in fact find it more difficult to do the wrong thing. And so you'll see that person, the more morally developed, morally cultivated person, doing the right thing as if it sort of flows out of their personality. But conscience is intervening. It's just that the pain of doing the wrong thing is so great that it's as if they're disgusted from it. They shy away from it as if they're afraid of a snake or something like that. Okay. So moral feelings are natural, but they have to be cultivated. Now I want to do a quick transition to chapter 4. And the question of chapter 4 is, how do we prove that the greatest happiness principle is the highest principle of ethics? Well, part of that is not difficult. We obviously all desire happiness, right? So nobody has to prove to us that we are in fact motivated to get happiness. What Mill has to prove to us, though, is something slightly different. And that is that happiness is the only thing that human beings desire, okay? Well, why would we think that we would desire anything else? Well, some people think that we desire wealth for its own sake, that we want money for its own sake. But Mill makes the point that I mentioned from Aristotle in one of the last videos, one of the videos for Tuesday, that wealth is desired merely as an instrument, right? In other words, we want wealth because we want certain things that wealth will give us. And you might say, well, some people just hoard money. They hoard money for two possible reasons. One, for the security of always having money and never having to be in want of anything, never to lack anything. The other possibility is they hoard money out of competition. They want to be able to say to someone else, I have more money than you do, or I have more money than he or she does. But either way, security, they're going to buy security with their money. It's because they think security will make them happy. if they're going to buy some sort of competitive advantage against their rivals through having a whole lot of money, it's because they think that winning the competition for wealth with their rivals is something that will make them happy. Okay, so then wealth is not something that we desire apart from happiness. We desire wealth because we believe that we can get happiness through it. Okay, second possible candidate, power, right? Aren't some people power hungry? Don't they just want power? Well, Mill thinks that we only want power for the things that we can do with it. And we want those things because those things will, we think, make us happy. We could be wrong about that, but they might. And pay attention to the fact that it isn't just evil people who want power. Good people also want power in order to do the right thing. So if you think about Martin Luther King Jr., did he want power? Surely he did. He had a conception of the civil rights movement, and he wanted to have the power to carry out and put into effect the civil rights that he was so convinced of. Okay, but that was not because he was hungry for power. It was because he thought that what he could get with power, which was to put these civil rights into place, was something that would make him happy. Finally, and here's the most controversial one, right? Virtue. Isn't virtue something that is beyond happiness, that we desire for its own sake, and not because we think we can make it, it can make us happy? Well, we already know that Mill has a different interpretation from most philosophers on that point, right? For Mill, to say that virtue is higher than pleasure is a conceptual error, right? It's to overlook the fact that virtue is about pleasure. It's just about a higher pleasure, right? Virtue makes us feel fulfilled as human beings. And that's precisely the kind of thing that turns out to be a higher pleasure for Mill.